Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of a cool evening in 1976, a night where the Pacific fog rolled over the hills of San Francisco like a heavy, damp blanket. It was February 11th, a time of year when the air carries a sharp, salt-crusted chill that seeps through even the thickest wool coat. The city was different then, a tapestry of neon signs and heavy iron cars, but the Sunset District remained a place of rhythmic quiet. Imagine the sound of the ocean, a low and distant rumble that you feel in your chest more than you hear with your ears. The fog was thick enough to soften the edges of the world, turning the streetlights into glowing, amber orbs that struggled to pierce the gloom. On Sandalwood Drive, the world seemed to have paused, catching its breath in the stillness of the late winter night. Every window was a soft, glowing square of life, hidden behind curtains that smelled of laundry soap and stale tobacco. It was a night for staying inside, for the comfort of a warm radiator and the low hum of a television set. Yet for one man, the night was just beginning to stir. The Sunset District is a place of repetition, a neighborhood of pastel row houses that stand shoulder to shoulder, their stucco walls painted in shades of pale mint, dusty rose, and sun-bleached cream. On this particular Wednesday, the houses looked like ghosts in the mist. The driveways were dark, the concrete cold and slick with the fine moisture that the locals call the marine layer. Sandalwood Drive was a portrait of mid-century suburban peace, far removed from the grit of the Tenderloin or the bustling energy of the Embarcadero. Here, the only sounds were the occasional drip of water from a rain gutter and the faint, rhythmic clicking of a cooling engine from a car parked hours ago. The air was heavy, almost thick enough to taste, a mixture of salt air and the earthy scent of damp garden soil. Somewhere in the distance, a foghorn groaned, a long and mournful note that echoed through the avenues, reminding everyone that the great, dark ocean was never far away. It was into this deep, suffocating quiet that Joseph Bentley lived his life, a life constructed of secrets and shadows, built upon the ruins of a past he was desperately trying to leave behind. Joseph Bentley sat in the dim light of a friend's apartment, the shadows dancing on the wood-paneled walls. The room felt small, the air thick with the smell of percolated coffee and the faint metallic tang of a weapon hidden nearby. He was a man who moved with a certain heaviness, a man whose eyes never quite settled, always darting toward the door, toward the window, toward the spaces where the light did not reach. His hand, thick and scarred from years of boxing and darker pursuits, rested on the arm of a velvet chair, feeling the rough texture of the fabric against his palm. The floorboards beneath his feet groaned with a familiar, low-pitched complaint as he finally stood, the sound amplified by the absolute stillness of the apartment. He reached for his jacket, the leather cool and stiff against his skin. The zipper made a sharp, mechanical rasp as he pulled it up to his chin, a sound that seemed to linger in the air for a moment too long. He stepped toward the door, his boots making a soft, muffled thud on the carpet. When he turned the brass handle, it was cold, a sudden, biting reminder of the world waiting outside. He stepped out onto the landing, the air shifting from the warmth of the home to the damp, biting chill of the stairwell, and began the slow descent toward the street. As he stepped onto the sidewalk of Sandalwood Drive, the night air hit him like a physical weight. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic click of his heels against the pavement. 1, 2, 3, echoing off the stucco walls of the neighboring houses. He walked toward his parked car, his silhouette blurred by the swirling mist. The streetlights overhead flickered with a low, electric hum, casting long, distorted shadows that stretched out before him like dark, reaching fingers. He reached into his pocket, his fingers brushing against the cold, jagged teeth of his car keys. He could feel the weight of a hidden pistol against his hip, a familiar comfort that had become a part of his very being. But tonight, the comfort was an illusion. From the corner of his eye, he noticed a movement, a pale shape sliding through the fog without the sound of an engine, a white van ghosting along the curb like a predatory shark in shallow water. It slowed as it approached him, the tires whispering against the wet asphalt. For a heartbeat, time seemed to stretch, the world slowing down until every drop of mist was visible in the amber light. The side door of the van slid open with a heavy, metallic groan, and the silence of Sandalwood Drive was shattered by a sound so loud it felt like the sky itself was tearing apart. The shotgun blasts were a series of violent concussions that ripped through the quiet air, 4 distinct explosions that echoed down the length of the street. The flashes of light were blinding, brief pulses of white and orange that illuminated the falling mist, and the terrified face of the man who had been known to the neighborhood as Joseph Bentley. Then, just as quickly as it had begun, the violence ceased. The white van accelerated, its engine finally roaring into life, the tires screeching briefly before it vanished into the gray veil of the San Francisco night. Joseph lay on the cold, wet concrete, the silence returning like a heavy tide. Slowly, lights began to flicker on in the houses nearby, pale yellow rectangles appearing in the darkness as neighbors peered through their curtains. The smell of gunpowder hung in the air, sharp and acrid, clashing with the salt of the sea. When the police arrived, their sirens wailing in the distance like wounded animals, they found a man who appeared to be a simple resident of the Sunset District. But as they looked closer, as they began to pull the threads of his identity, the name Joseph Bentley began to dissolve. Beneath the surface of this quiet neighborhood lay a story of a monster, a witness, and a betrayal that would change the American legal system forever. For now, however, the street was just a crime scene, a damp stretch of Sandalwood Drive where the fog continued to roll in, indifferent to the blood on the ground. The echoes of those final shotgun blasts in San Francisco fade into a distance of years, carrying us back to a much colder shore. Long before he was a target on a sidewalk, Joseph Barboza was a boy born to the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic in New Bedford, Massachusetts. It was September 20th, 1932. Imagine the air there, thick with the scent of salt brine, rotting kelp, and the heavy diesel fumes of the fishing fleet. The cobblestone streets were often slick with a fine mist that never seemed to lift, clinging to the wool coats of the Portuguese immigrants who labored in the textile mills and on the docks. Joseph was the son of Joseph Sr. and Pomada. His father was a man who knew the weight of a punch, a middleweight boxer who carried the physical scars of the ring into the narrow hallways of their home. There is a specific kind of silence in a house where violence is always breathing just behind the door. As a young child, Joseph watched his father's shadow grow long and heavy, learning early that the world did not offer comfort unless you took it with your own 2 hands. By the age of 13, he had already begun to drift into the gray spaces of the law. He and a group of local boys became known as the Cream Pie Bandits, a name that sounds almost innocent until you consider the wreckage they left behind. They broke into houses, not just for the thrill of theft, but to smear the walls with food and filth, a visceral act of defiance against a society that made them feel invisible. The New Bedford police saw a delinquent, but the streets were forging something far more dangerous, a spirit that thrived in the dark, damp corners of the city. The transition from a rebellious youth to a hardened criminal happened within the cold, gray walls of the Massachusetts reform systems. Joseph was sent to the Lyman School for Boys, a place where the air always smelled of floor wax and stale cabbage. It was a factory for resentment. By the time the 1950s arrived, the boy had become a man of iron and bone. In 1953, while held at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Concord, Joseph orchestrated an escape that would be whispered about in cell blocks for decades. It was the largest prison break in the institution's 75-year history. Picture the chaos of that night, the taste of contraband whiskey and the chemical burn of pilfered amphetamine tablets circulating through the veins of 7 desperate men. They overpowered 4 guards, the sounds of the struggle muffled by the heavy stone walls. When they finally burst through the gates and into the night air, they didn't run for cover. Instead, they rampaged through the streets of Boston, fueled by a manic, jagged energy. They beat strangers in the shadows and cruised the neon-lit bars of the city, savoring a few hours of wild, lawless freedom before the law caught up to them at an East Boston subway station. Even back in a cell, Joseph remained unbowed. He would slug guards in the cafeteria for a look he didn't like or hurl heavy wooden tables at anyone who stepped into his space. He was proving, day by day, that he could not be contained by stone or steel. When the gates finally opened and he returned to the world of the living, Joseph tried to find a legitimate path through the ring, following the ghost of his father. He fought under the name the Baron. Imagine the boxing gyms of the late 1950s. The rhythmic, hypnotic thud of the heavy bag, the sharp squeak of boots on canvas, and the haze of cigar smoke that hung like a low cloud over the front rows. Joseph was a light heavyweight with a broad chest and hands that felt like granite. He was an out-fighter, possessing a reach that allowed him to snap out punches with the speed of a coiled snake. His professional record stands at 8 wins and 3 losses, but the numbers don't tell the full story of the violence he brought to the ring. 5 of those wins ended in knockouts, moments where the world went black for his opponents under the weight of his rage. But the ring was too controlled for a man like Barboza. He hungered for a different kind of power, one that didn't end when the bell rang. He began to spend his evenings in the bars of East Boston, at a spot that became known as Barboza's Corner. He would sit in the dim light, his dark eyes scanning the room, as local hoodlums began to gather around him. He was a natural predator, and it wasn't long before his reputation reached the ears of the men who truly ran New England. By the early 1960s, Joseph had entered the orbit of the Patriarcha crime family. Raymond L.S. Patriarcha ruled from a quiet office in Providence, Rhode Island, but his influence flowed through the streets of Boston like an underground river. Because of his Portuguese heritage, Joseph could never be a made man. He could never take the sacred oath of La Cosa Nostra. To the Italian mobsters, he was often referred to by slurs, a tool to be used rather than a brother to be embraced. But Joseph didn't mind being an outsider as long as he was the most feared man in the room. He became a sidewalk soldier, an enforcer whose name alone could settle a debt. He moved through the combat zone, Boston's old red light district, where the flickering light of adult theaters and jazz clubs painted the rain-slicked streets in shades of crimson and amber. It was during this time that the nickname The Animal began to crystallize. There are different stories of how it happened, each more brutal than the last. In one version, during a brawl at a mob-controlled bar in Revere, Joseph became so enraged that he lunged at a rival, sinking his teeth into the man's cheek and tearing a piece away with the ferocity of a wild beast. In another, he gnawed on a piece of a victim's skull after a shooting. These weren't just acts of violence, they were messages. He was a man who had stripped away the thin veneer of civilization, revealing something ancient and terrifying underneath. The 1960s in Boston were a time of blood and fire, a period of gangland warfare that claimed nearly 50 lives in just a few short years. Joseph Barboza was the primary architect of that body count. He claimed to have ended the lives of 26 men, acting as the silent shadow that followed those who crossed the Patriarcha family. He would describe his methods years later with a chilling, detached calm, speaking of how he would stab men in the arms, the legs, and the chest if they dared to hide from their debts for too long. He was the man you saw in your rearview mirror on a deserted road, the heavy footsteps you heard in a dark hallway. He lived in Chelsea with his wife and children, maintaining a fragile image of domesticity while his hands were stained with the secrets of the underworld. He was a vital asset to the mob, a blunt instrument used to decapitate their enemies. But in the world of shadows, loyalty is a currency that devalues quickly. As the mid-60s approached, the very family that had built his legend began to view him not as a protector, but as a liability. The animal was becoming too loud, too erratic, and far too dangerous to keep on a leash. The same darkness that had carried him to the top was beginning to close in, and soon, the predator would find himself in the unfamiliar position of being the prey. Joseph Barboza sat in the deep, shifting shadows of a cell at the Massachusetts Correctional Institution in Walpole. The year was 1967, and the heavy silence of the prison was his only constant companion. It was a suffocating, stagnant silence that smelled of industrial floor wax, stale tobacco, and the metallic tang of old iron. He spent the long hours thinking of the $100,000. That was the staggering price of his freedom, the bail set by the court after his arrest in the neon-soaked, rain-slicked streets of Boston's combat zone. For weeks, he had waited for the word, listening for the rustle of paper or the familiar clink of coins that would signal the Patriarcha family still valued its most efficient instrument of death. But the money never came. The silence from the outside world grew louder every day, a cold weight pressing against his chest as he realized the gears of the underworld were turning without him. Instead of a rescue, the whispers filtering through the bars told a story of carnage. His closest friends, men like Joe Amico, were being hunted down and slaughtered in the streets for the simple crime of trying to raise the funds for his release. The realization settled in his gut like a piece of cold lead. He had been discarded. The man the underworld called the animal was being left in a cage to rot, while the wolves he had served for years prepared to tear his legacy apart. He listened to the distant, echoing clanging of iron doors. Each mechanical thud a reminder that he was now entirely alone in a world that rewarded a decade of loyalty with a shallow, forgotten grave. In the flickering, sickly yellow light of the prison meeting room, two men sat across from him, their faces obscured by the haze of the poorly ventilated space. Federal Bureau of Investigation agents H. Paul Rico and Dennis Condon did not look like the monsters Barboza was accustomed to, but they carried a different, more clinical kind of power. The room was small and the air was stagnant, clinging to the skin like a damp shroud. Rico spoke in low, measured tones, his voice cutting through the humid stillness with the precision of a surgeon. He told Barboza what the hitman already feared in his darkest moments, that Raymond Patriarcha had signed his death warrant. The contract was out, a staggering $300,000 promised for the head of the man who knew too many secrets. Barboza's knuckles, thick and heavily scarred from years in the boxing ring and the brutal back alleys of Boston, tightened around the edge of the scarred wooden table until his skin turned as white as bone. He could almost feel the phantom sting of a bullet, the sudden, final darkness he had delivered to more than 26 victims during his career. The code of silence, the sacred omerta he had studied so diligently despite his Portuguese heritage, was proving to be a one-way street. In that cramped, dimly lit room, he saw the opening, a narrow, treacherous path toward survival. He realized that to save his own life, he would have to do more than just talk. He would have to burn the entire criminal temple to the ground. This moment marked the birth of something the legal world had never seen, an experiment conducted in the deepest shadows called the Witness Protection Program. Before it had a formal name, and long before it was a codified system of laws and new identities, it was a desperate, ad hoc gamble centered on a desolate scrap of land called Thatcher Island. Barboza was moved there under the absolute shroud of night, the biting salt spray of the Atlantic chilling his skin as the small boat cut through the dark, churning waves off the coast of Rockport. On the island, the twin stone lighthouses stood like silent, ancient sentinels over his exile. He was guarded by a phalanx of United States Marshals led by John Partington, hardened men who slept with their boots on and their fingers never far from the triggers of their shotguns. The air on the island was thick with the scent of brine, rotting kelp, and wet earth, and the only sound was the constant, rhythmic crashing of the gray sea against the jagged, unforgiving rocks. For months, Barboza paced the confines of his hidden sanctuary, a ghost moving through a landscape of permanent fog and isolation. While he waited, in the distant offices of Washington, a young attorney named Gerald Schur began to draft the blueprints for a program that would fundamentally turn the tides of the war against organized crime, using the animal as its primary, volatile test subject. The day of the trial in 1967 arrived with a tension that seemed to vibrate through the very pavement of the city. The mafia had turned the streets of Boston into a literal hunting ground, with professional assassins stationed on every rooftop and in every shadowed doorway within blocks of the courthouse. They expected a traditional motorcade, a visible target they could strike with the concentrated fury of 1,000 grudges. But Barboza had become a shadow, a whisper in the wind. To ensure his heart kept beating long enough to reach the stand, the marshals resorted to the theater of the absurd. He was smuggled into the building 3 full days early, hidden in the back of a rattling, nondescript United States Postal Service truck that smelled of damp mail, ink, and old canvas. He spent those 72 hours in a windowless basement storeroom, sleeping on a narrow canvas cot tucked away amidst stacks of dusty records, moth-eaten flags, and broken furniture. The air was thin and tasted of lime dust. When he finally emerged into the light of the courtroom, it was as if he had materialized from the air itself, a specter rising from the floorboards. The gasps of the spectators were muffled by the heavy velvet curtains and the polished oak of the judicial benches, but the message was undeniably clear. The animal was out of his cage, and he was finally ready to speak. Standing on the witness stand, Barboza felt the physical weight of Raymond Patriarcha's gaze. It was a cold, predatory stare that had commanded the New England underworld for decades with a single nod. The courtroom was a sea of dark suits and frantic whispers, the atmosphere charged with the raw electricity of a historic betrayal. Barboza spoke with a chilling, detached calm, his voice steady as he detailed the inner workings of the organization and the specific orders given for the murder of Willie Murphy. He looked the boss directly in the eye and dismantled a criminal kingdom with nothing but his words. But the mob's reach was long, and their vengeance was always theatrical. Not long after the testimony began, a powerful car bomb tore through the quiet of a suburban street, shattering the morning peace with a deafening roar of orange flame and twisted metal. It was meant for Barboza's lawyer, John Fitzgerald. He miraculously survived the inferno, but the blast claimed his right leg, a brutal, bloody signature left by those who refused to go quietly into the night. As the smoke cleared from the streets of Boston, the world realized that the rules of engagement had changed forever. The first witness had crossed the line of no return, leaving a trail of fire and broken promises that would eventually consume everyone he had once called brother, and everything he had ever known. The aircraft roared through the heavy, gray clouds of the coast, a silver needle stitching together the vast distance between the world Joseph had known and the vacuum of the unknown. Below, the jagged, snow-capped peaks of the Rockies eventually gave way to the sun-scorched, amber basins of the west, a landscape that felt as barren and indifferent as his own conscience. He was no longer the animal, the man who had stalked the narrow, cobblestone streets of the North End with a predator's grace. As the wheels touched the sun-warmed tarmac in the year 1969, he stepped out into the golden, hazy light of California, carrying nothing but a small, worn suitcase and a heavy, invisible chain of secrets that rattled with every step. The air here was different. It was thin and sharp, carrying the faint, cooling scent of dry grass and coastal salt. The federal marshals, their faces etched with the deep lines of a mission they didn't fully understand, handed him a new life printed on thin, crisp paper. His name was now Joseph Bentley. It was a name that sounded soft, unremarkable, and safe. The kind of name a man might use to disappear into the beige, sun-bleached background of a suburban afternoon, fading away like a ghost in the midday heat. He was settled into a modest, unremarkable house in Santa Rosa, a place where the morning fog lingered in the valleys like a slow, cooling breath. The government, in its desperate and perhaps naive attempt to mold a professional killer into a productive citizen, enrolled him in a local culinary school. In the kitchen, the atmosphere was a thick, humid fog of rising steam and the pungent, stinging aroma of sliced onions and searing fat. Joseph found a strange, rhythmic peace in the mechanical nature of the work. He would stand for hours at a heavy wooden butcher's block, the weight of the French knife familiar and grounding in his large, scarred hand. The silver blade would flash under the harsh, humming fluorescent lights, slicing through raw meat with a surgical, practiced precision that made the other students turn away in an uneasy, prickling silence. He watched the blood pool on the white plastic board, dark and viscous, and for a moment, the sounds of the kitchen, the clatter of heavy steel pans and the sharp hiss of industrial stoves, would fade into the distant, rhythmic echoes of his former life. He was learning to nourish instead of destroy, yet the cold, unyielding edge of the knife always felt like a bridge leading him back to the man he was trying to bury beneath a white chef's apron. When the long shifts ended, and the sun dipped below the rolling, vine-covered hills, painting the sky in bruises of deep purple and aching orange, Joseph would retreat to the isolation of his small room. There, under the lonely hum of a flickering desk lamp, he turned to the one thing that seemed to offer a release for the storms gathering inside him: poetry. He would press a cheap, blue ballpoint pen into the paper until the metal nib nearly tore through the grain, the ink flowing out in jagged, desperate lines that looked like barbed wire. He wrote of the Boston streets, of the cold, gray Atlantic spray, and of the men whose faces were now only shadows in his mind. His verses were not elegant or refined. They were raw, pulsing things, filled with the bitterness of a man who knew he was a ghost walking among the living. He wrote about the double crosses and the gang wars, his words a rhythmic, ink-stained confession of the violence he had both witnessed and authored. The scratch of the pen on the page was the only sound in the house, a tiny, persistent ticking that filled the oppressive silence. In those moments, he wasn't a cook or a witness. He was a man trapped in the amber of his own memory, trying to find a rhyme for a life that had long ago lost all reason. But the newly minted witness protection program was a fragile, untested thing in the early 1970s. It was a system built on fragile hope and paper-thin lies, lacking the ironclad walls and constant, suffocating surveillance that would define it in the decades to come. Joseph was a predator kept in a cage made of fine silk. The federal agents who were tasked with checking on him were far away, distracted by the monumental, grinding task of dismantling the families back east. Left to his own devices in the quiet, sun-drenched streets of Santa Rosa, the old, familiar restlessness began to gnaw at his insides like a physical hunger. The silence of his new life was too loud, too heavy to bear. He began to seek out the shadows, the places where the air smelled of stale beer, cheap tobacco, and desperation. He eventually found himself at the Mirror Man Lounge, a dim, smoky watering hole where the light reflected off cracked glass and the floor was perpetually sticky with the remnants of the night before. Here, in the dim light of the neon signs, he could feel the magnetic pull of the underworld, a force that no name, change, or culinary diploma could ever truly break. It was in this world of low-stakes crime and desperate characters that he crossed paths with a man named Clay Wilson. Wilson was a small-time thief, a man with shifting, nervous eyes, and a mouth full of hollow, echoing boasts about stolen treasure and easy scores. To the animal, Wilson was nothing more than a nuisance, a flickering candle held up in the presence of a raging forest fire. They began to spend their days together, fueled by the shared, gritty language of the lawless, but the tension between them grew into a physical weight, thick and suffocating. Joseph grew tired of the posturing, of the smallness of this new world. The predatory instinct that had been suppressed by the federal government's promises began to claw its way back to the surface of his skin. He felt the old, familiar heat rising in his chest, a dark, pulsing energy that demanded the clarity of action. The quiet, simulated life of Joseph Bentley was dissolving, melting away like the thin morning fog in the California sun, revealing the jagged, lethal landscape of the man who had always been hiding beneath the surface. On a sweltering, airless night in July 1970, the pretense finally shattered into 1,000 sharp pieces. The group, Joseph, Clay, and 2 young women, drove out toward the darkened, rolling hills of Glen Ellen. The car's headlights cut narrow, lonely paths through the thick, velvet blackness of the countryside, illuminating the swirling dust of the road. They stopped on a rocky, secluded stretch where the air was heavy with the scent of dry pine needles and the distant, rhythmic chirping of crickets. Joseph suggested a walk into the deep shadows, his voice low and devoid of any identifiable emotion. As they moved away from the safety of the car's glow, the silence of the woods became absolute, pressing in on them from all sides. Then the stillness was torn apart by the sharp, echoing crack of a gunshot. 2 shots, fired in rapid, clinical succession, shattered the peace of the California night. Clay Wilson fell to the parched earth, his life spilling out into the soil under the long shadow of an old tree. Joseph stood over him for a long time, the weight of the gun still warm and familiar in his hand, the transition finally complete. He wasn't a poet, and he wasn't a cook. He was the animal once more, and the shadows of his past had finally caught up to him in the golden, blood-stained hills of the West. The fog rolled in from the Pacific like a heavy, wet blanket of charcoal and pearl, swallowing the street lamps of the Sunset District one by one. It is a damp, clinging cold in this part of San Francisco, a mist that turns the world into a series of blurred edges and half-seen shapes. For a man like Joseph, who had spent a lifetime navigating the sharp, unforgiving brick corners of Boston's North End, this western edge of the continent felt like a dream where the borders of reality were perpetually soft. He lived here under the name Joseph Bentley, posing as a chef, a man of simple means and quiet habits. He was a ghost drifting through a city of hills, convinced that 3,000 miles of concrete and mountain ranges had finally provided a barrier thick enough to muffle the echoes of his past. But the reach of the Patriarcha family was not measured in miles, but in the long, patient memories of men who viewed betrayal as a debt that could never be settled with anything less than blood. The silence of the Sunset District was deceptive. It was not the peace of safety, but the stillness of a predator that has already found the scent and is simply waiting for the optimal moment to strike. The investigation into the breach of his security would later point toward a devastatingly simple truth. It was not a high-level government conspiracy or a paper trail left by the Federal Bureau of Investigation that led the wolves to his door. Instead, it was the gravity of the underworld itself, a dark magnetism that pulls old associates back into the same suffocating orbits. Joseph had begun to move within the local circles of San Francisco, unable to fully shed the skin of the enforcer. He had sought out the company of James Chalmers, a man he believed to be a friend, or at least a familiar face from a life he was supposed to have left behind. They shared meals and stories in the small, cramped spaces of apartments where the smell of garlic and tobacco hung heavy in the air. But while Joseph saw a confidant, Chalmers saw an opportunity to settle his own standing with the powers back east. The leak was a whisper that traveled across the telephone lines, crossing the plains and the Great Lakes, until it reached the ears of Gennaro Anguillo in Boston. The word was out. The animal was no longer a myth or a memory. He was a man walking the streets of the 26th Avenue, vulnerable and unsuspecting. On the morning of February 11th, 1976, the air was particularly biting. The salt from the ocean nearby stung the eyes, and the wind rattled the window panes of the modest homes that lined Moraga Street. Inside the apartment of James Chalmers, the atmosphere was thick with a feigned domesticity. There were the sounds of silverware clinking against ceramic plates and the low murmur of conversation that masked the pounding heart of a traitor. Joseph sat there, perhaps feeling the weight of the .38 caliber Colt revolver tucked into his waistband. A heavy, cold reminder that he never truly felt safe, even among friends. He did not know that blocks away, a white van was idling, its exhaust disappearing into the gray sky. Inside that van sat Joseph Russo and Ilario Zanino, men who had traveled across the entire country with a single, focused purpose. They were the physical manifestation of the patriarcha's long reach. Shadows sent to ensure that the first man to ever break the sacred vow of silence would not live to see another spring. They waited with the patience of stone, watching the doorway of the house, their eyes fixed on the spot where the ghost would eventually become flesh. When Joseph finally stepped out onto the sidewalk, the transition from the warmth of the apartment to the raw California winter was abrupt. He walked toward his car, his hand reaching into his pocket for his keys, the metal jingling softly in the quiet afternoon. The street was nearly empty, a residential tableau of pastel houses and parked cars, all muffled by the persistent fog. He was just a man in a coat, a middle-aged chef named Joseph Bentley, going about his day. But as he reached the door of his vehicle, the white van pulled alongside him with a sudden, jarring screech of tires against the pavement. The side door slid open with a metallic groan that seemed to last an eternity. Joseph had survived countless brawls and hits in the past. His instincts were honed by decades of violence. He moved for his weapon, his fingers brushing the grip of the Colt, but the reach of the assassins was faster. 4 shotgun blasts tore through the silence of the Sunset District. The sound was not a sharp crack, but a series of heavy, guttural thuds that echoed off the rows of houses, shattering the peace of the neighborhood forever. The force of the lead sent him reeling backward, his body hitting the cold, damp concrete with a dull finality. Even as the life began to drain from him, the man known as the Animal did not go quietly into the dark. Witnesses would later recount the surreal image of a fallen man shouting obscenities into the fog as the white van sped away, its tires leaving black streaks on the road. He lay there on the sidewalk, the red of his life's blood blooming against the gray stone, a stark and violent contrast to the muted colors of the San Francisco afternoon. The investigation that followed was a frantic scramble of federal agents and local police, all trying to understand how the most protected man in the country had been found and executed with such surgical precision. They looked into the leak, tracing the movements of James Chalmers and the communications that had bridged the gap between the two coasts. They found a trail of betrayal that started in the kitchens of Santa Rosa and ended on a quiet corner in the Sunset. The realization was a bitter pill for the architects of the Witness Protection Program. They had built a fortress of new identities and relocated lives, but they had failed to account for the simple, human gravity of the past. The patriarchas had proven that no matter how far a man runs, the shadows of his former self are always walking just a few paces behind, waiting for the fog to roll in. The echo of the 4 shotgun blasts lingered in the cool, salt-heavy air of the Sunset District, long after the white van had vanished around the corner of 25th Avenue and Moraga Street. On that gray afternoon in February 1976, the pavement felt the heavy, rhythmic thrum of a city unaware that a ghost had just been laid to rest. The man who fell beside his car was known to his neighbors as Joseph Donati, a quiet man who kept to himself in the row of pastel-colored houses. But as the first responders arrived, their boots crunching on the glass and the spent shells, they found a man who technically did not exist. Beneath the tailored coat and the cooling skin of the victim lay the legacy of the most feared hitman in New England. He was found with a Colt .38 tucked into his waistband, a weapon he never had the chance to draw. The silence that followed was not just the absence of noise. It was the closing of a violent, chaotic book. The fog began to roll in from the Pacific, thick and white, swallowing the crime scene and the blood on the sidewalk, as if the city itself were trying to wash away the memory of the man they called the Animal. For years, the investigation into the death of the man in the Sunset District moved with the slow, agonizing pace of a winter tide. The authorities in San Francisco were left with a puzzle of aliases and shadows, while 3,000 miles away, in the narrow, winding streets of Boston's North End, the truth remained locked behind doors of thick oak and secrets. It wasn't until the early 1980s that the veil began to lift, not through a sudden confession, but through the patient, invisible ears of federal investigators. Inside a dimly lit social club near the Old North Church, where the air was always heavy with the scent of espresso and expensive tobacco, a hidden microphone caught the low, boastful murmurs of the underworld. It was there that the name Joseph J.R. Russo was spoken with a mixture of reverence and grim satisfaction. They called him a genius with a carbine, a dapper enforcer who had traveled across the continent to fulfill a blood debt that the mafia never forgets. The tapes captured the chilling reality of the hit, describing the patient stalking of the witness and the precision of the execution. The gears of justice, though rusted and slow, finally began to turn against the man who had pulled the trigger. When the day of reckoning finally arrived in 1992, the courtroom was a study in sharp contrasts. Joseph Russ sat at the defense table, a man of 60 years who looked more like a retired businessman than a legendary assassin. He was dapper, his silver hair perfectly groomed, his suits pressed with a precision that matched his reputation. There was a strange, almost surreal atmosphere as the charges were read aloud. Russo eventually chose to plead guilty to racketeering charges that officially included the murder of Joseph Barboza. The judge, in a move that would be debated for years to come, actually praised Russo for his intelligence and his loyalty to his associates, noting that it took a certain kind of courage to stand and accept the consequences of a life lived in the shadows. He was sentenced to 16 years in prison, a term that ensured the son would set on his own life behind bars. Russo would never return to the streets of East Boston. He died of cancer in a federal prison hospital in 1998. His passing was quiet, a stark difference from the violent end he had delivered to so many others. With his death, the direct line to the hit on the first protected witness was finally severed, leaving behind only the cold, hard facts of the record books. The death of the animal changed the landscape of American law enforcement forever. Before the blood dried on that San Francisco sidewalk, the concept of witness protection was a fragile, experimental idea. Barboza had been the first, the proof of concept, and his murder was seen as a catastrophic failure of the state's ability to protect those who turned against the dark. But in the wake of the tragedy, the program was rebuilt with a renewed, almost fanatical focus on anonymity and security. It evolved into the Witness Security Program we know today, a system that has since protected over 19,000 witnesses and their families. It is a program built on the hard lessons learned from a man who couldn't stop being a criminal even when given a second chance. The moral cost, however, remains a heavy burden. Decades later, the government was forced to pay over $100 million in settlements to the families of innocent men, whom Barboza had framed with his perjured testimony. It is a haunting reminder that to catch a monster, the law often finds itself making a pact with another. The legacy of Joseph Barboza is one of blood-stained progress, a foundation of safety for thousands built upon the lies and the violent end of a single, unrepentant soul. Tonight, the streets of the Sunset District are quiet. The pastel houses still stand, their windows reflecting the orange glow of the streetlights as the fog rolls in from the sea. There is no monument for the man who fell there, No plaque to mark the spot where the animal finally met his end. Joseph Barboza lies in a lonely grave in the South Dartmouth Cemetery in Massachusetts, far from the neon lights of the combat zone and the power of the Patriarcha family. The grass grows long and green over the site, and the wind whispers through the nearby trees, carrying no memory of the shotgun blasts or the white van. The secrets he kept, the lives he took, and the lies he told have all been swallowed by the earth. The world has moved on, the names of the hitmen and the bosses fading into the yellowed pages of old newspapers. The chaos of that era has been replaced by a deep, heavy stillness. We are left only with the stories, the echoes of a time when the lines between the law and the outlaw were blurred by the shadows of the night. The long journey of the first witness has reached its final destination, and the air is finally still. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.